James,
Hi,
how are you?
I'm doing good. Doing good.
Look at that. It's good to know. It's good to know. We're here in London,
Absolutely.
InfoSec Europe 2026. It's a good week to talk about policy and regulation.
It's always good to talk about policy.
Just ask the business, right?
Yeah.
We're spending so much money on policy. It's a serious thing, though. It's a serious thing. So we're going to get into what's going on here in the UK and Europe, and maybe compare and contrast to other parts of the world if you have some insights on that. And folks who listen to my show, I like to look at the operational and the business aspect of cyber and the impact those things have on the bottom line, ultimately, and how business and teams are run. So before we do that, though, who's James Morris? What are you up to?
Yeah, so I'm the director of the CSBR. We are a independent policy centre in the UK, which is dedicated to kind of looking at policy in the intersection between cybersecurity and resilience. I'm a former member of the UK Parliament, so I was a member of Parliament in the UK for 14 years. And among many other things that I did as a legislator, I was the chair of the all-party group for cybersecurity in the UK Parliament. And the remit of the all-party group was to bring together parliamentarians on a cross-party basis to talk about issues to do with cybersecurity and resilience for the UK, what needed to happen to raise awareness around those issues. I was a member of Parliament for 14 years. I fought 5 elections in 14 years. I served under 5 Prime Ministers. And after I left Parliament in the last election, we started the CSBR Policy Centre. And we've been focused very much on looking at how the UK should be responding to the cybersecurity and resilience challenge. The UK government has introduced a new cybersecurity and resilience bill to the UK Parliament, which is its response to the challenge. And we've been doing a whole bunch of work around research, around cybersecurity in our health system, the challenge of skills in the UK for cybersecurity and resilience. And we want to influence policy, and we want to influence legislation in the UK and internationally.
So how does, it's a big swath of stuff.
Indeed.
From skills to actually making a difference. How does what you do, well, I guess let me ask this question. It's hard enough getting multiple parties to come together.
Yeah.
And then you have the complexity of what cyber is and all the things you just talked about.
Yeah.
Right? How do you marry those two together? You talked about that intersection. How do you get the language of both to bring people together and bring it all together? Yeah,
well, that's the ongoing challenge, because obviously what we're interested in is looking at examples of what works, looking at evidence and coming up with policy ideas, but that then needs to be translated into practical reality, if that's the right way of describing it, which means we draw on quite a diverse range of different inputs. We're developing partnerships with academia, with business, with policymakers, and the way that we typically work is we have expert roundtables where we draw people together from a diverse background and pose a series of questions at the roundtables. And then we produce policy ideas out of that, and then we go back into the parliamentary community. So, for example, the all-party group, which is, as I say, it has representatives from all of the political parties, to try and get not necessarily seeking consensus, but seeking some kind of agreement. Because the thing about cybersecurity and resilience is it's not particularly what you would call ideologically charged. Right. So there aren't massive ideological differences. There might be differences between, whether we need to have tighter or slightly looser regulation and so on. But there tends to be an agreement that we need to get some of this stuff sorted out. And so we're using that platform to kind of influence debate in Parliament, influence the legislation, making suggestions about how it might need to change. So it's about trying to translate the ideas and translate what people are saying into kind of practical change, because that's what is required in the environment that we're currently operating in. I mean, I don't know whether you were hearing, the director of GCHQ, which is the centre of the UK intelligence services, has been making public statements about the nature of the resilience and security threat that the UK is currently facing. Now, when senior members of the intelligence services go out and start making public statements, you know that there's some serious issues. Yeah. So we're operating in the context of a debate where the external threat is very real. It's developing on a daily basis, and our legislation and policymaking community need to be responding to that in order to make sure that we're hardening our security as much as we can in an extremely complex world. Because even over the last 15 months ago, 16 months ago, there was a change of government in the UK, and then when there was a change of government, there was an introduction of this new bill. But if you think about the changes that have happened in the world in the last 15 months, technological change, AI becoming much more mainstream, geopolitical tensions around the world, shifting relationships, it's an extremely challenging set of circumstances. And we need to get it right.
Yeah. How do you balance the change, obviously the change in technology is a big thing, and staying current with that and understanding it well enough to then have a conversation at the policy level to not get too drawn into the weeds, so you're over prescribing or over dictating, and basically paralyzing.
Well, I think that's a really good question, and is at the heart of that the balance that needs to be struck. Because in the UK, our legislative process is a little bit cumbersome. It takes quite a long time to get laws passed. I mean, the Cybersecurity bill was introduced into Parliament 15 months ago, and it's still going through its stages, and it's probably not going to be operational in the UK until probably 8 to 12 months' time. So there's what you can't do, the challenge is you can't prescribe, because we don't know what the technological developments are going to be. So in the UK, one of the responses of the government was actually to that challenge is actually accruing power to itself. So in that bill, it's given quite a lot of power to change the regulations and change the laws if something emerges in the future. So that's the way the government has dealt with the technological uncertainty, by saying, well, we need powers to say, if X happens, we're going to designate that organisation or designate that sector, and because if it has a real threat to Britain's national security. So that's quite a top-down approach. That the government giving itself more power to respond makes sense in national security terms, but one of the downsides of it is that what we actually also need is a bit more of a bottom-up approach, because we need to make sure that business, I think you were talking about, you're interested in that, business needs to be on side with any of the changes, because what we don't want to do is create an enforcement regime which people are just kind of playing the enforcement regime, not actually implementing the changes which are required to make them more resilient. And so that's the central challenge of the legislation. I mean, this bill which is going through, it's essentially, we left the European Union, but this bill does actually bring quite a lot of the EU's cybersecurity legislation into UK law. But is also very distinctive, because the UK has quite a distinctive position in the kind of geopolitical context. We've got a very close relationship with the US on intelligence sharing and on cybersecurity. We've got the AUKUS relationship, which is the international relationship with Australia, and the UK is a permanent member of the Security Council. So we've got some very distinct issues, but we are bringing some of the EU regulations into UK law. So it's quite a kind of complex picture in terms of the way where the UK sits in the international landscape.
So can you describe what some of the discussions sound like in terms of what are the challenges we're facing, how do we write policy to address some of those challenges? And what I'm thinking of here is, well, just simple thing is resilience.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
You hear a lot of people talk about it. Is it protecting? Is it good detection? Is it response? Is it doing the right thing from the business in the first place? Is it
It's probably all those things.
Right, but I think some people pick and choose what works for them.
No, I think it does. And I think you're right that historically there's been quite a narrowish definition of resilience, because when policymakers talk about resilience, often they're referring to critical national infrastructure, defined as power plants, rail systems, and that kind of thing. Whereas actually what's happening is, I think our definition of resilience is beginning to evolve, because resilience is about kind of the underpinnings of a modern economy. So, for example, in the UK over the last year or so, there's been some high-profile breaches in some of our largest companies, like Marks and Spencer, JLR, a big car manufacturer in the West Midlands, all had very significant breaches which paralysed their businesses for a while. And what that promoted was a changed conversation about what we mean about resilience, because those two businesses actually wouldn't be captured in the those two incidents that I described would not have been captured within this new legislation which is coming through the UK Parliament, but yet they are fundamental. So I think the definition of resilience has to be more about economic resilience, and the way that cybersecurity and the necessity of hardening our resilience is an underpinning to the whole of our economy. And I think that's been an ongoing debate in the policy making community, which is, when you talk about resilience, we're not just talking about technical resilience. Right. We're talking about something which is much more overarching than that. Even to a discussion which is slightly off topic, which is about the actual resilience of our political system itself. Because the UK has burnt its way through political leaders, questions about how our democracy works, questions about the impact on the ability of the UK government to think about long-term issues. Because the thing about cybersecurity and resilience, even though the technology landscape is changing really rapidly, actually one of the challenges is it's one of those long-term issues which requires patience and attention over a long period of time. Problem with our political system, not just in the UK, probably in the US and in different parts of the world, is our attention spans are a little bit limited, and we want politicians to give us answers today, and we haven't got the kind of investment in patience which is required to realise some of these long-term policy goals. So that's also a resilience challenge as well, because we're not going to be able to implement some of the long-term stuff that we need to improve our economic resilience if we don't have a political system which is able to see through the changes that we need.
Right. And as you were talking, I was kind of thinking about the supply chain. You talked about a couple of companies that had, which impact a lot of people serve those companies, and those companies serve other, and obviously imports and exports, and a huge shakeup if something big happens like that. How do you look at the supply chain, the end party vendor landscape?
Well, absolutely. I mean, absolutely critical to the resilience of companies large and small. And one of the things which the bill I've been describing does is it starts to mandate that certain critical parts of a company's infrastructure can be designated as a critical supplier with a different regulatory regime. So again, for the first time, it's recognizing the importance of supply chains and the fact that certain critical nodes in a company's supply chain need to have special designation and then special regime around transparency, incident reporting and hardening. So the only thing that this bill doesn't do is, the UK has one of the most competitive and largest financial services industries in the world, and actually financial services is not part of this bill. Financial services is got its own regulatory regime, which is a bit of a moot point about whether financial services should be brought into the regime, because the issue you're describing about supply chain, particularly pertinent to our financial services industry, which have very complex digital supply chains, which can be very, very vulnerable. But the point I'm making is there has been a recognition in this legislation that supply chains are important, that companies need to designate and understand their supply chains in much more detail, and to be aware of what the vulnerabilities are, have transparency over what their supply, where people sit on their supply chain, and how those vulnerabilities might impact their business.
Yeah. So as we wrap here, James, maybe a thought or some advice to business owners.
Yeah.
How should they think about this? How should they prepare? And maybe some tips.
Yeah, what I think, notwithstanding the legislation, I mean, I think it's all about the fact that cybersecurity and resilience is now kind of front and center. It's not a peripheral technical issue which can be dealt with by IT people. It's a boardroom or business owner issue. For larger companies, it's got to be right at the center of the way that they think about the strategy of their business. CEOs have to be, they can't just delegate it and think it's going to get sorted out. It's absolutely critical. And actually the kind of prevention piece. So one of the things that we're seeing is a lot more prevalence around kind of simulations. So, I've been involved, for example, in running some simulations where we have technical people running a simulation around a particular breach that may happen, but the other things which companies need to be aware of is the potential impact on reputation. They're going to have the media crawling all over them asking questions. How do you handle all of that so your business doesn't collapse, that you have an opportunity once you've sorted yourself out to re-emerge? So I think in summary, it's a board level issue. It's not just a technical issue. It's to do with reputation management, how you handle that whole process. And how resilience is technical, but it's also to do with kind of overall kind of managerial resilience and the resilience of the organisation itself.
Yeah. I love it. Well, I'm a nerd for this stuff. I could probably I have about 100 questions in my head.
Sure.
Maybe we could have a follow-up chat.
Maybe we could
after the show and dig deeper into some of the things you're working on, and maybe bring some other folks in to have a deeper chat as well.
Sounds like a good idea.
James.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this. Stay tuned for more coming from InfoSec 26.